Hello everyone. In our attempt to understand the basics of Indian history, we're talking about certain very significant aspects. Bhakti movement is considered one of the major socio-religious movements in the Indian subcontinent, which actually changed the socio-cultural outlook of India. Bhakti movement has been talked about in the context of northern India and southern India. In both these areas, the movement took place at different points of time and different places. In southern India, we find a demarcation of the Shaivite tradition and the Vaishnavite tradition that happened in the 7th century. We find the Alvars, the Vaishnavites, and the Nayanar, the Shaivites, who were trying to create a sense of semblance of bhakti, of personal devotion. The bhakti was a movement which challenged the idea of rigorous rituals, liturgical practices, and eventually focused on personal veneration of God. Right? This is something that we find semblances in Puranic literature as well. From Puranic literature onwards, we find semblances of bhakti, which eventually got manifested as a form in a form of movement in the 7th century in southern India. So there are texts like Nalira Divya Prabandham, which was a collection of writings of the Alvars, or we find references to Appar, Sundarar, Karaikal, right, Andal, all these kind of bhakti saints that were emerging in the southern India. In the North India, we find different places bhakti movement emerging as a form of syncretism, right? Syncretic culture that was formed as an association between Sufism, Nathpanthi, Gorakhpanthis, different strands of Hinduism, which challenge the upper caste tendencies prevalent in different kind of cultural tradition and the religion, right? Many of these bhakti saints that emerged from 13th to 15th and centuries and later on belong to marginal section of the society who were either economically or socially backward group. Many of these sages or saints were not even known historically whether when they were born, where they were born, which society did they belong to. Many of them questioned the practices of the traditional Brahmanical society, right? So we have people like Kabir, we have people like Tukaram, we have Gyandev, we have Namdev, right? In different regions, different kind of bhakti saints start emerging, right? Mirabai, a women bhakti scholar who actually challenged the warrior tradition and basically was forced to practice the worship of Tulja Bhavani, and she refused to do that and focused on the worship of Krishna. In this particular context, in northern India, we find there are different strands of bhakti that were emerging. Two major strands were the Sagun Bhakti Shakha and the Nirgun Bhakti Shakha. The Sagun Bhakti basically means a form of God, which venerated God in different forms. And Nirgun is Bhakti Shakha included people who believed that God was formless. Right? Those who belong to Sagun Bhakti Shakha also were divided among the Ram Bhakti Shakha and the Krishna Bhakti Shakha. So we have people like Tulsidas who were belonging to Ram Bhakti Shakha and Rats Khan or Surdas who belong to the Krishna Bhakti Shakha. Among the Nirgun Bhakti saints, we find references to Kabir Das, right? So these kind of sages were challenging the caste system, the gender bias, right? The kind of superstitions that were prevalent in the Indian society. They also had a very strong influence of the Sufi tradition that was developing from the 12th century onwards in the Indian subcontinent. So Chishti, Suravardis, and Naqshbandi, Kalandaris, all the kind of Sufi discourses that were emerging from this period, they were assimilated along with the traditions of the Hindu traditions, and it created new kind of cultural ideas. In regions like Maharashtra, we find two other different classes of bhakti movement, which is called the Varkari and the Dharkari movement. The Varkaris were largely considered to be the reformers who basically wanted, who were challenging the caste system, who were challenging the uh, Brahmanical tendency, right? And rather talking in terms of inclusive of godliness. Okay. In that we find the reference to people like Tukaram or Namdev, right? And then there were people who believed in the creation of orthodox or traditional values, right? It included Samarth Ramdas. That tradition was the revivalist tradition, included the Dharkari tradition. So all these traditions were very much significant and created a new kind of literature in the Indian subcontinent. A lot of these literature that was composed by these Bhakti poets existed in oral forms. They were written down much later, and perhaps there can be a lot of interpolation in these writings. Right? Kabir was a Julaha who was a weaver, right? So he was not a very literate person. So was Mirabai. Her works were majorly orally transmitted, right? So we find a lot of these writers, a lot of these saints actually composing oral compositions, which were later down compiled. Other writers, there were other writers who Abhangas of Tukaram are also oral tradition. There are also writers who have created large number of literature in their disposal, right? Like Tulsidas, who actually composed writings like Ramcharitmanas, which popularized the story of Ram, which was already very popular, but in local languages, in the local dialect, which was accessible to the common people. Also, writers like Gyandev, who basically composed the Bhagavad Gita in Marathi. So, one of the significant literary aspect of the Marathi literature was found in this context. So, Bhakti movement, in a way, was providing a kind of overhauling of the Indian society and culture and religious tradition. It challenged the caste system, it challenged the religious tradition, it challenged the gender system. People like Lal Ded, who are coming from Kashmir, they are basically providing that the Bhakti movement was not related to just one area. It was spread across different territories, from Kashmir to Rajasthan to Uttar Pradesh to Maharashtra, right? In Karnataka, different places, different ways of Bhakti movement was emerging in that context. So, Bhakti movement is an essential movement for anyone who is trying to understand the history of medieval century, the history of Indian subcontinent, right? Because without knowing it, you will not be able to understand the dynamic that existed in Indian society and how it changed over time, how it interacted with different cultures and created new ideas, new idioms, new literature, and new philosophies. Thank you very much.